Thank you, Damir, for this very nice introduction and also for the invitation. It is my pleasure to be here virtually, and I also thank you all for being here and listen to this talk. So I would like to dedicate this talk to Martin and Virginia Davis, who died on the first day of this year. So I think you all know that Martin was a great logician, but he and his wife were most of all really wonderful human beings, and they will be very much missed. And Martin will return a couple of times throughout the talk. So the central argument of my talk is obvious from the title, is this idea that we should care a bit more for a diversified understanding of computability. And I believe this can be achieved by diving a bit deeper into the history of the field. My motivation for doing this kind of research is anchored in the need or the question of a foundation for computer science. So as was shown quite clearly by Matti Tedre in 2015, even to this day, there are a lot of debates on the nature of computer science. And this is very much anchored in the dual nature of computing, which can be seen both as a science, and this is of course where logic and mathematics come into play, and as a technology. Because of this dual nature, we see that there is a lack of a coherent understanding in the field, where each is having their own specialization and smaller topics they are working on, which increases a risk of a one-dimensional and disconnected set of understanding. So there is no common or shared understanding anymore, or at least I don't really see it. This is all the more worrying, at least to me, given the fact that the technology, as a technology, it is becoming more and more a transparent technology. It is there, but you cannot see it. So we are using it all the time, but we don't really have a sense of the techniques that lie underneath the technology we are using. So my general approach, in a sense, to kind of go against this is to, in a certain sense, try and reverse engineer foundations of computing through historical research, and without supposing or assuming any kind of opposition such as that between science and technology. And one approach I tend to apply in that kind of research is to what I call here to deconstruct, to reconstruct. So essentially it comes down to questioning accepted wisdoms, and then see if we can gain something from that questioning of the accepted wisdoms. So, and today for this talk, I would like to apply that to the foundational model of computability, which is the Turing machine. So in the first part of this talk, I will try and answer the question of why the Turing machine is still regarded as the model of computability. I will focus a little bit on epistemological reasons, but argue that there are also certain socio-historical reasons at play there. And after an intermediate in conclusion, I will then move on to the second part of my talk and argue why I believe it is important to not just focus on the Turing machine, and provide a number of arguments for that. So, let me start with the first part of this talk. The picture, for those of you who are not familiar with deconstructivist philosophy, the picture is a caricature of Jacques Derrida, a very well-known philosopher who introduced the method of deconstruction in philosophy. And it says, look here, it has been deconstructed. So it's a kind of joke on Jacques Derrida's methods. So here on the slide, you can see a number of quotes from people who are very much convinced of the significance of the Turing machine model as the foundational model. So the first quote comes from Jack Copeland. Turing was the first to describe the basic logical principles of the modern computer, writing these down in 1936, 12 years before the appearance of the earliest implementation of his ideas, the computer. quote by Papadimitriou. Eventually, I did put it all together, how a British mathematician named Alan Turing answered through his machine the world's most fundamental question, what can be computed? And then finally, a quote by Vitagni. In the last 3/4 of a century, the Turing machine model has proven to be of priceless value for the development of the science of data processing. All theory development reaches back to this format. The model has become so dominant that new other models that are not polynomial time reducible to Turing machines are viewed as not realistic. So, but of course, these quotes are all coming from a particular community, a particular corner. These are people that all focus very much on computability. But based on some personal experience, it is at least quite clear to me that this is but a very small community, and that there are a lot of other communities out there that don't really share this view. So what about historians, programmers, engineers, philosophers, etc., etc.? In each of these communities, you can find favorite models and favorite heroes. And what I want to propose here is that if we want to have a more diverse understanding of computing, we need to step away from what one community is taking for granted and try and connect or reconnect with other communities. So the claim that the Turing machine is the model of computing can in fact be split into two separate claims. The first claim relates to theory, to computability. It is the idea that the Turing machine is the ultimate model of computability. So this is captured by a first version of the so-called Church-Turing thesis. Any computable function is Turing computable. The second claim relates to the modern computers. The Turing machine is the ultimate model of the modern computer. So this gives a second version of the Church-Turing thesis that you can find in the literature. Anything that can be computed by a Turing machine can be computed by a computer. Of course, these claims are very different from a more general computability thesis, in which you consider an equivalence class of formalizations of computability that then impose a basic theoretical limit on what can be computed. And I see this computability thesis, in fact, as a protection against computationalism, but I'm not going into that here. So why the Turing machine and not, for instance, lambda calculus? So of course, there are a number of arguments to be found in the literature for both of the two claims. So in relation to the first claim, the theoretical claim, the Turing machine as a model of computability, I think it was Bob Zaar who phrased it most clearly in a famous paper of his, in which he argues that we should be speaking of computability theory and not of recursion theory. He claimed that it was Turing alone who gave the first convincing formal definition of a computable function. His arguments, I'm not going to summarize the whole paper here, but three main arguments in that paper are that in the 1936 paper by Turing, he provides an intuitive argument to support the thesis that Turing machines indeed capture all computable functions. What he did in the paper was to analyze the process of a human computing a real number and derive from that a number of abstract properties that then led him to the formulation of the Turing machine concept. As he said in the paper, the real question at issue is what are the possible human, this is my addition, processes which can be carried out in computing a number. Moreover, the 36 paper contains the concept of a universal Turing machine, which is very basic. And of course, but this is not only applicable to Turing, it contains an argument by confluence. So, well, in his paper, he showed some of the possible reductions, but later on, a huge number of different formalisms have turned out to be equivalent to Turing machines. So in relation to the second claim, the Turing machine as the ultimate model of the modern computer, I see mostly two main arguments. The first is that the Turing paper from 1936 already contains the idea of the stored program computer, which is then seen as the main thing about the modern computer. This is a quote by Gandhi from 1988. The universal machine is a stored program machine that is, unlike Babbage's all-purpose machine, the mechanisms used in reading a program are of the same kind as those used in executing them. A second argument here is that the Turing paper contains already the core of the idea that hardware and software are interchangeable. And I return to both of these claims later on. So these are some clear epistemological reasons. But these, so sorry, I forgot to say, if there is anything that is unclear, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. Sorry. So these are some clear epistemological reasons of why the Turing machine is seen as the ultimate model. But as I argue here, these cannot be isolated from certain socio-historical forces. And in the remainder of part 1 of this talk, I will focus on these. So first of all, I look at the first claim. So the Turing machine as the ultimate model of computability. So let us have a look at Turing's original version of the paper from 1936, where, and this is the statement I found of Turing's thesis in the paper, the computable numbers may be described briefly as the real numbers whose expressions as a decimal are calculable by finite means. According to my definition, a number is computable if its decimal can be written down by a computing machine. Now, I'm not sure how many of you read Turing's original paper, but one thing that is clear is that it doesn't really contain the halting problem in its current form, because a normal Turing computation is not supposed to halt. The Turing machines are computing real numbers, so they only halt when they are not functioning. Also, in the formulation of Turing of the Turing machine, he introduces what we now call the quintuple notation. So, sorry, I have a question. I am, of course, assuming that you are all familiar with Turing machines. Is that a correct assumption? Yes? Okay, sorry. So in the Turing paper, he derives this number of basic operations. He says that they are so elementary that it is not easy to imagine them further divided. But as I just said, he uses a quintuple notation in which printing and moving are actually both part of the same action when the machine is in a given state reading a particular symbol. Moreover, in the paper, there are a number of implicit and explicit conventions and restrictions. So Turing relies on, and this is in particular important for the universal Turing machine, two types of squares, F&A squares, and two kinds of symbols. The sequence computed on the F squares in the universal Turing machine cannot be changed. The machine will never print a symbol on an empty F square if the F square preceding it is also empty, and he uses a one-way infinite tape. Post spoke in this context, and I return to that later, of the spurious Turing convention. So in the meantime, in 1936, there was, of course, also the basic work by Church and Kleene and Rosser on recursive functions and lambda definability, and of course Church's proposal of his thesis, the identification between effective calculability and recursive functions and lambda definability. But in 1936, there's also what I have called Post's second thesis. So in 1936, Post published a very short paper titled Finite Combinatory Processes Formulation 1. It's only 3 pages long. It's a very nice read. I recommend it to everyone because it's so easy to read. And in it, he proposes formalization of solvability. In Post's formulation, a general problem is solvable in the intuitive sense if, for each instance of the problem, we can set up a finite one process that solves it. So a finite one process is captured by the formulation one and has been stated by others a couple of times. This formulation appears to be almost identical to that of Turing. So I explain it here very quickly. So instead of a tape, the formulation works as a workspace. It consists of a set of boxes that are ordered linearly next to one another. It's two-way infinite. And in these boxes, there is a worker working in them. So there is an infinite, two-way infinite sequence of boxes in which the work leading from problem to answer is to be carried out. It uses a binary alphabet. A box is either marked or unmarked. And then the worker, when in a box, is capable of a number of primitive acts. So he can, or they can mark or unmark a box. They can move one box to the left. They can move one box to the right. And they can determine whether the box they are in is marked or unmarked. Based on these primitive acts, the formulation one relies on a set of directions, which then set up a deterministic process when applied to each specific problem. So a direction in the set of directions can have one of the following forms. Either it does one of the primitive acts O1, O4, so mark, unmark, move left, move right, and then go to another instruction, or determine whether the box is marked or unmarked, and then depending on the answer, go to one or another direction. Finally, Post also had a very explicit stop operation in the set of directions, because of course you want to solve a problem, and once it's solved, it needs to stop. So then in 1947, Post, and this note was kind of known, but I come back to that later, how it was perceived at the time. So in 1947, Post published a paper on Q's problem, in which he solved, in which he proved that the word problem for semi-groups is recursively unsolvable. In that paper, he uses Turing machines, but in a highly modified form, which has as much in common with formulation one as it has things in common with the Turing machine formulation. So instead of the quintuple notation of Turing, it uses a quadruple notation. So it's less compound and is more in the spirit of the formulation one. It has a two-way infinite tape. There are no alternate squares. There's an explicit halt operation. And in a footnote, he also remarks that there are several similarities with the 1936 paper by Post. In a very lengthy appendix, he also provides a rather strong criticism on the Turing paper, in which he says that it seems to the writer that Turing's preoccupation with computable numbers has marred his entire development of the Turing machine. We therefore suggest a redevelopment of the Turing machine based on the formulation given in the body of the present paper. In fact, and this is not something that is mentioned on the slide, the spirit of the Turing machine of Post is actually one that is very close to post-production systems, which I will discuss in a couple of minutes. This was analyzed in much detail in a paper by Wilfried Siek and Martin Davis from 2015. So why then are we talking of the Turing machine and not, for instance, the post-Turing machine? So again, I come back to some epistemological explanations that I found in Bob Zohar's work, and in which he writes, it is often and erroneously written that Post's contribution here from 1936 was essentially the same as Turing's, but in fact it was much less. I would actually say that it was not more or not less, but it had there were some basic differences. Anyway, Post did not attempt to prove that his formalism coincided with any other formalism. Post gave no hint of a universal Turing machine. Most important, Post gave no analysis, as did Turing, of why the intuitively computable functions are computable in his formal system. Lastly, Post, of course, did not prove the unsolvability of the Entscheidungs problem. So all of these arguments can in fact be countered if one knows more about Post's actual history, which is often neglected or forgotten. In the early 20s, Post embarked on a rather ambitious research project in trying to prove the whole of first-order logic decidable. So, but at the end of that work, this 1-year work, he was convinced of the exact opposite, and that actually first-order logic is undecidable. So this work was written down in notebooks, time accounts, they are lost. But an account of the work was submitted by Post in 1941 to the American Journal of Mathematics, but of course it was rejected because the results were already published by Church and Turing at the time. So to go a bit deeper into this, and so, yeah, sorry, quite basic here is also that the text that was submitted to the American Journal of Mathematics was then posthumously published in the anthology by Martin Davis, The Undecidable, and it was titled The Account of an Anticipation. So in 2021, as I said, Post embarked on a project to attack what he called the finiteness problem of symbolic logic. Essentially, it came down to proving the decidability of formal logic, and in particular first-order logic. That is the Entscheidungs problem. So his approach was quite particular in the sense that he was convinced that what had to be done to prove that was to try and develop what one could call the ultimate formalism for finite symbolic reasoning. So in order to achieve that, he set out on a number of formalizations, starting from Principia Mathematica. In essence, he started out from the formulation of propositional logic in Principia Mathematica. He provided his own formalism for that. Based on that, he provided a generalization known as the canonical form A. Then from that, he went to canonical form B. From that, he went to C. And from that, he went to the normal form. This sequence of forms, in this sequence of forms, his method becomes very clear. It is driven by a method of generalization through simplification. As he emphasized later himself in the submitted text from 1941, this derives from the idea of a symbolic logic rather than that of an algorithm, and may be described by saying that each member of the sets is at some time generated, produced, created, in practice written down. So on this slide, you can see two of these forms. I don't know how far you are familiar with them. So at the top, you can see the canonical form C, which is today known as a post-production system. So essentially a kind of substitution systems. At the bottom, you can see the highly simplified normal form. And so Post was able to show that all the canonical form A, B, and C all reduce to the normal form. He was also able to show that first order logic reduces to the canonical form B, and hence it also reduces to normal form. But of course, at that time, he was trying to prove the decidability. In order to do the reverse, he would have to reverse the reduction, obviously. So when working in these, especially in this normal form and actually an intermediate form, which I will not discuss just now, the form of tag, he steadily became more and more convinced of the fact that these forms actually would turn out to be undecidable. But in order to be able to prove this and to claim this, he had to claim the generality of the form. And this is captured in Post's first thesis. So it was Martin Davis who called this Post thesis. Any finite sequence of symbols that can be generated by some finite symbolic process can also be generated by a system in normal form. Based on that thesis, or assuming that thesis, he gave an informal proof of the unsolvability of the finiteness problem for the class of all normal systems. But Post was, and so, sorry, I lost a little bit my thread here. So let me now revisit the arguments by Bob Zaar, and let me first go to the absence of the appeal to intuition argument in the 1936 paper. So at the time in 2021, Post himself was very convinced of the generality of the normal form. He was convinced that all of finitary symbolic logic would reduce to the normal form, but he also understood that the arguments he could give for that were quite internalistic in a sense. He only had all of these reductions, but no appeal to intuition. As he said in the account of an anticipation, for the thesis to obtain its full generality, an analysis should be made of all the possible ways the human mind can set up finite processes to generate sequences. Note the similarity here to Turing's phrasing, what are the possible processes which can be carried out in computing a number. So, and this is, I know this is a speculation, so it is clear from the account of an anticipation that Post embarked on this process of giving a full analysis. And the speculation I at least make is that the 1936 note is a result of that analysis. So the argument what could give there is that is why else, how else do we explain that Post ended up with a formalism that is quasi-identical to Turing's? So concerning universality, it should be remarked, and this doesn't just apply to Post, but also to Church, I believe, is that he had a kind of formalism that in a footnote, because in the, sorry, I forgot to mention this, in the account of an anticipation, you have the main text, which is text from the period 2021, but it's full of footnotes, and it also has an introduction, and of course these were added later. So from the main text, he talks about the complete system K. We shall refer to the system K as a complete normal system because in a way it contains all normal systems. He also needs to use the complete system K in his informal proof of the unsolvability of the normal form, the finiteness problem for normal form. In a footnote, he then added the complete normal system would thus correspond to Turing's universal computing machine. As I said, I don't think this argument just applies to Post, but also, for instance, to Church, as was remarked by Robin Gandhi in his paper titled The Confluence of Ideas, that was published in 1988. Church, Kleene, and Turing all used a similar argument to show the unsolvability of the Enchiridium's problem. And in each of their works, they all use a uniform process U, which provided with a putative specification for a calculable function f, and the numerical argument m will calculate the value fm if this is defined. In Church's case, this is the function e. In Turing's case, this is the universal Turing machine. So concerning equivalences and confluences, I hope it is quite clear that in the early work 2021, Post went through a long sequence of reductions, starting out from Principia Mathematica to canonical form A, B, C, and then the normal form. And then in a letter he sent to Church in 1936, he gave also a proof of the reducibility of the lambda definable functions to canonical forms. Church was not convinced initially that the production systems would be as powerful as the lambda definable functions, and he convinced him by giving that reduction in the letter. It's a 10-page letter. Finally, the Enchiridium's problem, at least there is a claim of a proof that the normal form was at least as powerful as first order logic, given that he had reduced first order logic to canonical form B, which reduced to the normal form. So again, here we might ask why Turing and not Post. I believe that here there are some socio-historical explanations at play. So the most tricky slide is this one, as Damir might know. There is the social context that needs to be taken into account. At the time, Emil Post was a Jewish immigrant from Poland. In the US, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. There were Jewish quota at some renowned universities, Ivy League universities. Moreover, there's a rather sad personal history of Post. He was manic depressive. So in 2021, while he was working on the tax systems and realized that his whole projects of proving the decidability might be, totally wrong, he got his first manic depressive attack, and this haunted him for the rest of his life. Probably he died of a heart attack because of the electroshock treatments he received to handle his manic depressive state. He was also handicapped. He only had one arm. He had a very heavy position at the New York City College, so it was mostly a teaching position. There was hardly any time for research. He could not have any PhD students, and he also had experienced a lot of problems with getting his work published. This was one of the reasons why he did not publish his work from 21, because he had had very bad experiences. So this, compared to Turing, is quite different. Socially, concerning the social background, Turing had a distinctive family tree of English gentry, far from rich, but determinedly upper middle class in the peculiar sense of the English class system. He had a permanent position at King's College, and that was at the time very different from having a position at New York City College. So I hope you can understand and accept this argument. I think it's fair to say that even to this day, the social background and the universities where you work play a major role in the way your work is being received. If you are coming from Harvard, it makes a huge difference from coming, for instance, from the University of Lille, I would say. There was another university there yesterday, but I decided I replace it by the University of Lille. So there was also the intellectual context at the time in the 30s and 40s. So I think one major impact were Church's reviews of Post's 36 paper and Turing's 36 paper. So Church was very negative about Post's paper. So I read the quote: Post proposes a definition of finite one process, which is in fact equivalent to computation by a Turing machine. He does not regard this formulation as certainly to be identified with effectiveness in the ordinary sense, but takes this identification as working hypothesis in need of continual verification. To define effectiveness as computability by an arbitrary machine would seem to be an adequate representation of the ordinary notion, and if this is done, the need for a working hypothesis disappears. So the background here is that he actually rejects Post formulation 1, because Post insisted on calling the identification a working hypothesis, or at best a natural law. So in the correspondence between Church and Turing, this becomes between Church and Post, sorry, this is very clear that they had a complete disagreement on this. So for Church, one can only speak of a definition. To Post, he insisted on the hypothetical character of such a thesis. So and this is the background of the negative review. In contrast to that, he wrote about the Turing paper, computability by a Turing machine has the advantage of making the identification with effectiveness in the ordinary sense evident immediately. Post's contributions were recognized by, amongst other, Kleene and Gödel, and often compared with Turing's, but often in a footnotish manner. And there was, of course, Post's own usage of the modified Turing machine in the Chu paper. It would probably have been far better for him if he had referred to his own formulation 1, or just called it, had given it another name. I also note here that actually in 1947, Markov provided also a solution to the Chu problem, but used the normal form, and the proof was much shorter. I think it's only 2 pages long compared to Post's proof. So then in the 1950s and 60s, there is another intellectual context. There is here a basic role to be played by Martin Davis's book, Computability and Unsolvability, in which the notion of the Turing machine has been made central in the development. This book had a huge influence on early computing people, because it really introduced the Turing machine in the very small community at the time. The irony of the book is that actually it says that it uses for the formulation of the Turing machine, not Turing's original paper, but post-formulation as given in the Chu paper. Furthermore, of course, and I'll return to that later, there was the appeal of the universal Turing machine idea as a model for computers, as is clear from these quotes by Hartmanis and Stearns. The reason we have chosen this particular model, a multi-tape Turing machine, is that it closely resembles the operation of a present-day computer. So from there, we really see the immersion of the Turing machine concept in computer science. But clearly, or at least I hope I have somehow convinced you, the Turing machine is also very much a post machine. So this is not just about historical correction, to be very clear. In the second part of my talk, I hope it will become clear why I am insisting so much on this, and also the significance of being aware of how certain things become accepted in a community, not just for epistemological reasons, but also because of socio-historical processes. So let me now turn to the second claim. I'm looking at the time. Oh, I'm really running out of time already, so I need to be, I'm very sorry. I was stuck too much in the post story. So the second claim of the second claim, the Turing machine as the ultimate model of the modern computer. So here we can distinguish two claims: an epistemological claim, the universal Turing machine as the perfect model for the modern stored program computer, and then a historical claim that Turing is the father of the modern computer. So this historical claim, there have been given several objections by historians against this. I will not go into them, sorry. My main argument I wanted to give you here is that the stored program itself has nothing to do with a theoretical insight, but is a corollary of a practice. So, and to argue for that, I need to make a large detour, and I fear I don't have the time to make that large detour. So let me try and summarize it. So, as you might know, the modern computer arose not in the context of mathematical logic, but more in the context of solving problems in applied mathematics. And so this number crunching that was needed to attack these problems was laborious, lengthy, and error-prone. And to solve that problem, you see a development of a number of techniques to control the lengthiness and the error-proneness of these processes of computation. So essentially, it comes down to developing techniques that automate, that are fast, and that are precise. This can be analyzed historically into three main techniques that were introduced. So the first one is precision, essentially the introduction of digital machines to replace analog machines. Secondly, automation, the use of sequencing loops and discrimination, and the automation of so discrimination is essentially conditional. And thirdly, this is the one I wanted to emphasize, is electronic speed, which was introduced by ENIAC, one of the first computers. And it is the electronic speed of ENIAC, together with its general programmability, that resulted in a new and theoretical reflection on programming, not the converse. So first of all, and this is actually confirmed by a lot of quotes on the slide, I will give a quote by von Neumann. The introduction of the stored programming concept only makes sense in a context of high electronic speeds. Von Neumann really saw it as an engineering solution. In an electromechanical machine, and I quote, you express your desires in some code, you put this code on a tape, and you have a machine which can scan this tape. You cannot use this approach in an electronic machine because the speed with which you pick up orders is much too slow. It is mismatched to the speed with which you carry them out. It is evident that in order to be efficient, you will have to treat the problem of logical instructions on the same level on which you treat memory problems. So in order to understand the real significance of logic and formalization and theory in early computers, it is quite basic, I believe, to differentiate between different kinds of formalization. So there was already the use of symbolization of program instructions in other electromechanical machines. We already have the storage of numbers and programs in the same electronic medium, which can be seen as a corollary of the high speed. And thirdly, and I think this is the main place where logic got introduced in the early years in computing, there was the use of a symbolization to develop a logic of programs. Also, this was very much anchored in the high speed of the machines. Essentially, they were going too quick, and there was a need for a panoptic foresight. And to control that, to have a control over the dynamical process of a high-speed computation, logic was introduced, amongst others by John von Neumann, but also, for instance, by Haskell Curry in 47 to 49. Sorry to be very quick here. So based on all this, I believe that to focus on ad hoc theoretical concepts, which is the Turing machine, obscures the relation between practical issues and the need for theory to deal with them. So finally, why was the Turing machine actually introduced in computer science? I cannot go into this very deeply now. There are two basic things that happened. In the mid-50s, there was an intuition amongst computing people that these machines were actually general purpose, but it was an intuition, an experience. They didn't have a real argument for that. The Turing machine helped them to actually show this. A minimal number of instructions suffices to achieve general purpose computation. And there were a lot of people designing computers at the time who picked that up. So there was a quote by Frankel, but I apologize, I cannot read it now. Secondly, late 50s, early 60s, people are working on automatic coding, automatic programming, and the development of high-level programming languages. There, Turing's paper was introduced again as a theoretical argument to show that it was fine to work at a high level of notation, because they ultimately always translated to the hardware. So this is essentially the introduction of the idea that hardware and software are interchangeable. So yeah, so this is clearly, there is a realization of the need for a rapprochement between the theory and practice of the computing, and definitely the universal Turing machine played a basic role there. There was also at play there a socio-historical motivation. There was an increased need to establish an academic field of computer science, and if one could rely on mathematical logic, that gave a certain seriousness to the field. But based on this, we see a steady conflation between what happened after the facts and what actually happened. So what actually happened is that we retrofitted the past to current needs. So intermediate conclusion. So yes, the Turing machine is a basic model of computability and computers, but that is as much an effect of socio-historical and contingent processes as it is a reflection of significant epistemological insights. So absolutist epistemological arguments tend to ignore historical reality with the risk of creating a bias and tunnel vision. So, and this kind of epistemological arguments are also not always in function of the science. Often there are other agendas behind it, such as political agendas, sociological agendas, etc., etc. There are plenty of other cases to be found in the history of science. So this is not the only case. So there is also a case to be made, for instance, with Carl Friedrich Gauss in mathematics. Now I need to make a quick remark about equivalence arguments to move on to the second part of my talk. So a central argument for the so-called Church-Turing thesis, the Church-Turing thesis, is that there is an equivalence between an ever-growing number of formal models, and that this suffices, and that based on that it suffices to focus only on the best model. This is true, but only under a particular notion of equivalence. It ignores or underestimates the significance of other intentional differences between the different models. And this is what the second part of my talk is about. And I'm very sorry to be quick. Which is about why I think we should care about a bit more about the differences. So I give a number of arguments. The first is that different models actually result in different theses. So I already mentioned quite a lot about Post. He was definitely not the only one doing formalist work in the 20s and early 30s. You also have people like Church, Curry, and Schoenfinkel. They were working in a very different context from compared to Turing. In the 20s and early 30s, they were formalists in search of an ultimate form of symbolic logic or reasoning. They were not yet focusing on computation at all. So this partially explains, not completely, partially explains or reflects a diversity of a reliance on different intuitive notions. So Church spoke about effective calculability. Curie, I'm not claiming that Curie also had a thesis because I haven't properly studied Curie, but he wanted to provide a formalization of valid thinking. Post spoke in his early work about symbolic reasoning. Turing spoke about human computation of real numbers. The later Post spoke about solving problems in a finite number of steps. And we can extend this list to today. So there was Gandhi's work who spoke about computation by mechanisms. There is work on interactive computation, concurrency, artificial intelligence. So these are all intuitive things, if you want. These are all notions we are using as computer scientists, as logicians, as programmers. If we all assume that they all reduce to the Turing machine, then we are losing a certain essential difference between all of these different notions, I believe. So we need to ask ourselves, in what sense are these all the same, and in what sense do they differ from one another? To be very clear, I'm not claiming that we need to go beyond the Turing limit or anything like that. That's very important. Different models also result in very different uses. So two very quick cases. So I already quickly summarized the significance of the Turing machine in the computer science discourse in the mid-50s to early 60s, but also post-productions became quite important, but on another level, not on the level of as a machine model, but on the level of programming. So for instance, Bacchus has stated on several occasions that he was inspired by talks by Martin Davis on post-production systems to propose the Bacchus norm, which is in a sense a production system. I found a letter from the Burroughs Company, one of the seven dwarfs, in which they invite Post, saying, we are interested in your productions and your theory, which appeals to us as possibly the most natural approach to the theory of computability from the standpoint of one interested in syntactical machines. And of course, there's also Chomsky, who was very much influenced by post-production systems. But it's not just about Post. So for instance, Church's work and the lambda calculus has had a very basic influence on the theory of programming. So I think it's quite well known that McCarthy heavily took inspiration from the lambda calculus to develop his work on Lisp. And as he says in his paper Towards the Mathematical Science of Computation, Turing machines are not conceptually different from the automatic computers in general use, but they are very poor in their control structure. A practical theory of computation must be applicable to particular algorithms. So the Turing machine is good at some things, but very bad at others, especially in the theory of programming. I have not seen much of an inspiration from the Turing machines there. A very nice, but I cannot go into it, a very nice case here is also Landin's work on the SECD machine, which is essentially a virtual machine for functional programs. At the beginning of the paper in which he presents this, he very explicitly says that we are in need of a formalism that is much closer to our intuition of what a computation or a program is. And essentially, the SECD machine is then based on the idea of evaluating lambda expressions. So different models give rise to different uses or different applications. So here we need to ask ourselves, what is it exactly about these activities that are needed to program a computer that makes the Turing machine less suitable? Different contexts require different models. Their intentional differences are, I believe, fundamental and need to be taken into account. And I'm not the only one to claim this. Possibly this might lead us to a direction in which we consider a different number of theses next to one another. So for instance, one can think of Landin's thesis, SECD machine formalize our notion of information processing systems. Different models also have different capabilities. I fear I have to skip this because this is a little bit technical. It relates to the notion of weak and semi-weak universality. I cannot go into it, but essentially the argument here is that models that work with an infinite tape, like cellular automata or Turing machines, can implement weak universality, but post-tag systems, for instance, but also the normal forms, are incapable of formalizing that. So they don't have the same capability in a sense. So the supposed equivalence from this perspective is not valid. Tag systems cannot effectively be weakly universal. Finally, a more philosophical argument, if you want, which was inspired by a quotation from Church. A very early citation. The early work by Church is really very interesting because he has a very different take on things than compared to later, I think. We do not attach any character of uniqueness or absolute truth to any particular system of logic. The entities of formal logic are abstractions invented because of their use in describing and systematizing facts of experience or observation, and their properties depend for their exact character on the arbitrary choice of the inventor. In building the geometry, the proposed application to physical space serves as a rough guide in determining what properties the abstract entities shall have, but does not assign these properties completely. Consequently, there may be, and actually are, more than one geometry whose use is feasible in describing physical space. So obviously, abstraction is always bounded by the reality it abstracts from, but never completely captures it. And because of this, one abstraction only cannot and should not be allowed to suffice. To elaborate on this, if models of computation are abstractions from a reality, and if we assume that one and only one model suffices to capture computation that never assigns the properties of that reality completely, only the relevant ones, then we assume that essentially all of the essential aspects of computation then and now and in the future are present in the Turing machine model. To me, at least, this is a denial of the historicity of technology itself. So Turing's thesis, to conclude this argument, indeed establishes theoretical limits on what can be computed, but it does not really capture what computation, programs, algorithms, and computers mean today. To conclude or to end with the discussion, and I'm sorry to be so quick, that was not my intention. So I think that the complexification of our own histories is a good thing, not a bad thing. It shows, at least to me, the philosophical and practical richness of the field. It also enables to reconnect different practices and views through that history, which I believe is very fundamental in computing today, as I argued at the beginning of my talk. In essence, I also believe it's basic to be realistic about one's own practice, which is never only driven by pure science, but always shaped by complex socio-historical processes. This is unavoidable also for me. I'm also shaped by a number of socio-historical processes locally and globally, but it's important to be aware of that. And because of all this, one should not get stuck in one class of models. It shall and will limit your thinking. And in that context, I wanted to refer to the debate on hypercomputability, because I think that debate was failed usually because it was so focused on one very particular interpretation of the Turing machine model, which was actually not the model Turing proposed in 1936 anyway. So, and these are two quotes I like, and that somehow for me fitted with the talk. So I thank you all for your attention, and I apologize again for having stalled too much on Post, which meant that I had to move quickly when I was getting to the core of my arguments. Thank you.